In 1864, a large number of people consisting of around 9,000 Navajos from Arizona were rounded up and forced to walk a distance of approximately 300 miles. The natives were relocated by the United States Army after a massive, long and exhausting war, which led to the surrender of the Navajos. They were heading towards internment camps at Bosque Redondo in eastern New Mexico. It was an immense difficult journey that involved crossing arid deserts with hot temperatures during the day and freezing cold nights. They went through rugged mountainous areas, canyons, and open plains with little shelter, exposing the Navajos to extremely harsh weather conditions. The natives faced physical exhaustion, dehydration, and disease, all of which contributed to the unfortunate suffering and loss of hundreds of Native American men, women, and children. But General James Henry Carleton couldn't care less when he saw the suffering of the people that once fought with utter determination against his army. The only thought that he had in mind was to neutralize the fierce resistance and facilitate the westward expansion of the United States. It was a difficult and utmost challenging campaign before he could subdue the Navajos, and it took him almost 4 years to stop the resilience of the Native American tribes in the region. They were extremely determined to protect their lands, resources, and way of life from encroachment and control by the US government. They employed various tactics in their resistance, including guerrilla warfare and hit-and-run attacks against US military forces and settlers. They also were able to utilize their knowledge of the local terrain such as canyons and mountains to their advantage. But despite all of that, General Carleton succeeded in neutralizing the native warriors by using a more aggressive approach than his predecessors. In 1863, the final phase began where he launched a brutal scorched earth campaign against the Navajos, destroying their crops, livestock, and homes to force their complete surrender. It was mainly because of this belligerent strategy that the United States of America was able to do what the Spanish Empire once dreamed of realizing, and that was the total submission of the Navajo Nation. In the year 1582, the first European intrusion into the land of the Navajos came from the south. Spanish explorers under the leadership of Antonio de Espejo led an expedition to gather information about the then unknown region. The interactions with Navajos were initially peaceful. Curious about the Spanish newcomers and their goods, such as metal tools and weapons, the Navajos began to exchange goods and information with the Spanish. However, when the Spanish sought to exert control over the region, conflicts over land, resources, and cultural differences began to escalate. The Spanish attempted to convert the Navajos to Christianity and integrate them into their colonial system. The natives were exceedingly resistant, leading to periods of tensions and violence. In contrast to the Anglo-American westward expansion 2 centuries later, the Spanish failed to hold off Navajo raids and assert control over the region. This was partly due to the more fragmented control and other priorities within their vast colonial empire. The United States, on the other hand, by the time it was expanding westward, had a more centralized government and a unified strategy for dealing with indigenous peoples, including the Navajos. The strategy would include, as earlier mentioned, the policy of forced relocation. This brutal strategy was not implemented by the Spanish. The US government also established legal frameworks, treaties, and reservation systems that allowed them to exert control over the Navajos and other indigenous groups. Furthermore, during the late 19th century, the United States implemented policies aimed at assimilating indigenous peoples into mainstream American society. The Spanish Empire, on the other hand, had, compared to other parts of their empire, a relatively limited presence in the American Southwest. As a result, their influence on the Navajo people was less extensive than other parts of their empire. The empire would eventually cease to exist in North America after the Mexican Revolution of Independence in the year 1821. Mexican authorities similarly tried to assert control over the region, but since the Navajos fostered fighting experience during the time of their former colonizers, it became even more difficult for the Mexicans to subdue the Navajos. The Mexicans also faced a better advanced Navajo force than their predecessors. The introduction of horses by the Spanish allowed the Navajos to expand their territory and increase their mobility in combat and raiding activities. Mounted Navajo warriors had a higher vantage point and could quickly engage or disengage from combat situations. The sight of mounted Navajo warriors could be intimidating to the Mexicans, providing a psychological advantage in addition to the physical advantages of horseback riding. Raids were oftentimes strategically, taking advantage of opportunities when Mexican settlers were less vigilant or when the settlements were more vulnerable. The Navajo raiders relied on the element of surprise to carry out their raids. They would approach settlements quietly, typically under the cover of darkness, and strike quickly before the settlers could mount a defense. After conducting a raid, the Navajo raiders would retreat quickly, using their horses to escape back to their territory. The speed and mobility provided by horses allowed them to evade pursuers effectively. Later in time, during the Mexican expansion era, Mexican settlers began to build fortified settlements called presidios, which were basically military outposts with defensive walls and watchtowers. These presidios provided some protection against Navajo raids. Additionally to that, Mexican settlers would form alliances with other Native American tribes who were enemies of the Navajos. These alliances provided additional manpower and knowledge of the terrain. The neighboring Utes, for example, were one of those tribes. They were overall traditional enemies of the Navajo even before the Mexican expansion. The Utes' knowledge of the terrain and their own conflicts with the Navajo made them useful allies. Some Apache groups, such as the Mescalero and Jicarilla, also had conflicts with the Navajo and were occasionally aligned with Mexican settlers. Despite Mexican incursions and attempts at controlling the Navajo people, the Navajos still managed to maintain a degree of autonomy and independence during the Mexican period. But this would all change in the year 1848, when the Republic of Texas joined the United States as a state in 1845. U.S. troops were sent to the disputed area between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. Mexican forces saw this as an invasion of their territory and attacked U.S. troops on April 25, 1846. After the skirmish between Mexican and American troops, the U.S. Congress officially declared war on Mexico, on the grounds that Mexican forces had attacked American soldiers on American soil. The Mexican-American War, which lasted from April 25, 1846 to February 2, 1848, resulted into Mexico signing the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which Mexico ceded about one-third of its land to the United States. This included present-day California, Nevada, Utah, parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Arizona, and New Mexico. This meant that Native American tribes in these regions came under U.S. control, resulting in a complete loss of their sovereignty. As the United States expanded westward into the newly acquired territories, Native American tribes, including the Navajos, faced increased pressure on their lands. Settlers moved into these areas in large numbers, eventually encroaching on Navajo land and leading to what would later be known as the Navajo Wars. The first major tensions broke out between the Navajos and the United States when the U.S. Army established Fort Defiance in Navajo territory in 1851, present-day Arizona. This move was seen by the Navajo as an encroachment on their land and sovereignty. And so, it wouldn't take a decade for Navajo warriors to launch an attack on the fort on September 30, 1860. The natives were led by the prominent chief Manuelito, who earlier in other occasions was involved in smaller skirmishes with the U.S. Army. Manuelito's forces charged the fort by surprise in the early dawn hours, and thereby were able to inflict casualties among the strong barricaded U.S. forces. The attack on Fort Defiance was intense but ultimately unsuccessful. After an exhausting fight, the U.S. forces at the fort eventually repelled the Navajo warriors and were able to hold their position due to its robust walls and armaments. The siege on Fort Defiance highlighted the growing resistance of the Navajo people to American military presence in their territory. However, it would set the stage for the final phase of the military campaign against the Navajo people 3 years later. In 1863, United States Army officer named Christopher Houston Carson, also known as Kit Carson, led a force of approximately 400 U.S. soldiers into Canyon de Chelly, located in northeastern Arizona. This canyon is a sacred and important area for the Navajo people. It was a natural fortress with towns towering walls and numerous caves and ledges, providing ideal refuge for the Navajo during conflict with the US Army. Carson's forces employed a scorched earth strategy in the canyon. They systematically burnt Navajo crops, destroyed orchards, and killed livestock. These actions were meant to deny the Navajo the resources they needed to survive. Carson's troops moved through the canyon searching for Navajo people hiding in caves and ledges. They aimed to capture or force the surrender of as many Navajos as possible. Some Navajo warriors and families attempted to resist or evade Carson's forces. They utilized the natural terrain of the canyon to their advantage, hiding in caves and high ledges. But due to the destruction of their crops and livestock, many Navajo people faced starvation, and ultimately the last Navajo warriors would surrender to Carson's forces. Thus, the Battle of Canyon de Chelly would be marked in history as the turning point in the Navajo struggle against US military forces. This catastrophic event disrupted the Navajo traditional way of life and led to the forced removal of many Navajo people to a place far from their traditional homes in Bosque Redondo. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to be notified about our latest videos.